This week we will begin a unit on Neoclassicism, or the Revolutionary Period. Neoclassicism is the literary time period, and then Revolutionary Period is the historical time period. So this is a space of time about 50 years from 1740 to 1790. As you can see, it's the end of the First Great Awakening, which is why I use Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God as a transition into the Revolutionary Period as we end Puritanism. Some important dates to remember, and this is especially for those of you who've had American history this semester. These dates should be familiar to you. So first you have the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. And the reason this is important is because it caused great debt for England. So England needed to find interesting and creative ways to pay for that debt. So you begin to see a series of taxes for the colonists. So acts imposed by the British. First of all, in 1763, you have the Proclamation Act, and that act basically says that colonists cannot go west of the Appalachian Mountain Range. And if you've been to the mountains of North Carolina, you can understand why. They're very challenging to travel through. There's a lot of, obviously, trees, underbrush, and it would have been a problem if the British tried to look for their colonists who traveled west of the Appalachian Mountains. They would no longer have control. And then you have the Stamp Act. One of the podcasts you could have listened to over the weekend concerned the Stamp Act and specifically the protests that occurred. You know, we often hear about the Boston Tea Party, but the Stamp Act and those protests were very powerful also. And then you have the Townshend Act, the Intolerable Acts, the Quebec Act, the Boston Port Act. That was as a direct result of the Boston Tea Party. The Quartering Act, which basically said that if troops needed housing, they could come to your house and request that housing, request that food, in order to take care of them. In terms of literature, during this time period, you see a lot of speeches and a lot of written pieces in different forms. So in 1775, Patrick Henry has his speech to the Virginia Convention. That is an example of oratory. So oratory is just a fancy word for speech. That is one piece that we will study. Then we will study Thomas Paine's Common Sense, Crisis Number One, one of his pamphlets that he wrote during the Revolutionary period. And then, of course, you have Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Then in 1782, you have Jean-Guillaume de Crèvecoeur. He wrote Letters from an American Farmer. An epistle is a fancy word for a literary letter. So what makes an epistle different is that it's written to a group of people. One of the most common places that you see this word used is with the Bible in the New Testament. A lot of those books in the New Testament are based on epistles that were written to specific groups of people, like Corinthians was written to the people of Corinth. Philippians was written to the people of Philippi. And then in 1787, you have the Constitution drafted as a document. So finally, you do have characteristics of Neoclassicism, just as you do in Puritanism, and you start to see a shift in thinking within the colonists during this time period. So whereas the Puritans believed in predestination, that idea that God had determined whether you were going to heaven or hell, the issue was you didn't know which one it was going to be. Neo-classicists believe that man determines his own destiny. It's not that they didn't believe in God, they still had a very strong faith. It was just the way they practiced their faith changed. And a lot of that was because of the First Great Awakening. Then you have sovereignty, that man has responsibility in Neoclassicism, man has responsibility for the earth. So, whereas the Puritans would believe that if there were a hurricane, a tornado, a drought, something horrible happened to your barn, the Puritans believed that it was some sort of punishment from God and that you shouldn't help others. But in Neoclassicism, it was believed that man has responsibility for everything within or on the earth. So, in other words, man has the power to protect himself from a hurricane. Remember, this was also a time of great achievement in science. We were starting to understand more about weather patterns, illnesses, that sort of thing. So they believed again that yes, God has control, but part of that control is that God gave humans brains to problem solve, and that it's our responsibility to use that. Omnipotence, that idea that God is all powerful. In Neoclassicism, you see the age of reason, that man has the power to improve his own life. You don't have to wait for God to do it for you. Again, that idea that God has given man motivation, initiative, perseverance, that you can use those qualities to improve your own life. You don't have to wait on the sidelines for God to do something. And then, of course, in Puritanism, you had plainness. And remember, plainness was not only in their clothing, but in their speech. You saw it in their homes. But in Neoclassicism, you see the rebirth of the classics. And for those of you who have been to places like Williamsburg, you definitely see that. And when we say classics, we mean Greek and Roman. So you see art, music, architecture, literature. You start to see more ornate decoration, whether it's in the architecture or even within people's homes. You're starting to see some fine china and silverware that's made not just for utilitarian use, but is made to be a work of art, made to be something beautiful to show off. You start to see more mirrors, more paintings during this time period. So you see a definite shift in colonist thinking during this time period. So in Neoclassicism, we will look at several documents and really look at what rhetorical moves, what rhetorical strategies did the speech makers use or did the writers use to develop their arguments.